5 years since the start of the devastating war in the Tigray region, and 3 years since the Pretoria Agreement that ended it, we are bracing if a return to conflict is a likelihood. On Wednesday, the 5th of November, authorities in Ethiopia's Afar regional state reported that, quote, 6 villages were seized and civilians were shelled in Magale Warada. The attack, they alleged, was carried out by forces from the neighboring Tigray region. The Afar authorities have warned of retaliation if hostilities continue. As of this recording, the Tigray regional government has not issued a statement. There is also no corroborating evidence that emerged so far. But this latest report is a stark reminder that the narratives and the political tensions born in the aftermath of the Pretoria Agreement continue to evolve, often violently, but also systematically. It also underscores why conversations about legitimacy, militarization, and the manufacture of war narratives remain.
My question to kind of the diplomatic community and all of the scholars and so on who are justifying this kind of violence, and there are many, people like Stephen Durkin from Oxford has been a big kind of ideological godfather of this project. And my question to these people is why 2 decades after we've admitted that we have an ideological problem, are we killing hundreds and thousands of people in order to institute these ideas that we know don't work? So that really is the question. And in terms of who benefits, we've seen it's the creation of the oligarchy, which obviously had it's interesting to me. The first Trump presidency was kind of the evangelical MAGA base, right? The beginnings of this Trump presidency, we saw kind of the oligarch, the tech bros and so on come out.
Yeah, very specific concentration of yeah.
And the very, very first thing they did was cut off aid for the world's poorest, most vulnerable, and so on, right? And they're doing this in order to what? Have that money then subsidize their companies, right? So that's the game everywhere. In sort of classic Marxist language, the compradors in Ethiopia to me are very minor players, in the overall global scheme of things. And I think perhaps a really good explanation, or not explanation, but sort of illustration of this is the Canadian mining companies and their interests in Tigray, Eritrea.
And the Tigray, yeah.
Yeah. Sun Peak used to be called, I think it was, I've forgotten the name, Nvidia? Not Nvidia, I'll look it up, but they were, not implicated, they were, there was a landmark case in Canada several years ago that basically held them responsible for the enslavement of Eritreans in Eritrea.
Eritrean miners, yeah. I think a subsidiary of that company has recently been acquired by yet another company based from the UAE.
Yes.
There is that connection there. Part of that company was acquired by yet another company from the UAE. Yes, there's a connection of slavery of the Eritrean miners there. Yeah,
exactly. And it's interesting because I think, like, sort of at the micro level, you're having, I think, infighting between, and this is a bit like sort of between ENDF and TDF generals over gold resources, let's say, and there's been interesting movements. I think it's sort of the flow of gold has moved southward, where during the siege and kind of in the early starts of, or in the early period of the Pretoria, the flows were very much northward. Either way, though, they're ending up in Dubai.
What do we need to understand when it comes to situating Tigray as a utility of portraying it as a proxy force? The political utility of portraying the region overall as a proxy force. why are we getting that? What are we benefiting from pushing this agenda?
Well, who are we? I don't. I think that's part of it is the defining of the we. Look, I think in terms of what's incentivizing war, not just in Ethiopia, but really across the continent. What we've seen in the late 2000, early so 2020, around the time of the war, you saw the you saw what was being dubbed by kind of the Heritage Foundation and other groups as structural adjustment 2.0. And this, everywhere from Ghana to Sudan to Kenya to Uganda to, I mean, the whole continent was being given a kind of second dose of the neoliberal pill. And what we've seen in those 5 years is a huge uptick across the continent of violence, to varying degrees, but of violence. You're seeing protests, the Gen Z protests erupting in reaction to neoliberal policies, right? And to kind of the structural adjustment 2.0 program. I do think the militarization, to be fair, the militarization of Tigrayan politics was initiated by Getachew and Tzadkan's insistence that the military be involved in internal TPLF political processes, right? So this was at a time, I think Getachew made several mistakes. I think one of his major mistakes is having an academic understanding of the TPLF. I don't. Part of what hurt him in the end is that he is through and through a Qatadiso baby. He didn't go through any of the TPLF political training. Didn't go through any of the. He was kind of given a shortcut to power. Sabhat Naga, in fact, gave him a shortcut to power. So what that means is that he never developed the stamina, for instance, for TPLF meetings, but he also doesn't know the party at an operational level. He has a purely academic understanding of the party, and if you talk to any given scholar or academic, what they will tell you is that the TPLF is a top-down institution. I don't see any of the opposition groups in Tigray asking, and I think this was also at the founding of Simrat. Getachew was also saying something about a transitional government, etc., etc., etc. I think he's kind of using the Walqait Asmalash Comité people as a model for how you can govern without consent through sort of the violent backing of the federal government. I think we can see Western Tigray as an example of how they plan to govern the rest of Tigray and how they plan to hold on to it, right? I think that's kind of clear. And I also think TPF, the Walqait Asmalash Committee, certainly fits the kind of RSF mold of UAE-backed militia groups across the continent.
A caution against the feverish propaganda being pushed by Ethiopia's political elite, army generals, mid-level officers, state media, and the hundreds of thousands of pro-government social media activists and content creators advocating for sovereign Red Sea access for commercial and security purposes. In his analysis, Jawar presents 5 core arguments explaining why this aggressive push, including by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, mirrors the Karayu Oromo's ancient warning about unchasing a sword where no war exists.
Went way further than he did before, clearly indicating how easy it is to crush the Eritrean forces for Ethiopia and to capture the port and make Ethiopia have a sovereign access to the sea. And I thought that was very dangerous. I thought that was misleading the nation. I thought that was misleading, probably not the regional powers, but at least for the citizens who are eager to have access to the sea. He made it look so simple, but when we look deeper, on all measurements, on the military affairs, diplomatic affairs, economic affairs, Ethiopia has declined over the last 7 years. Even if we assume ENDF is numerically strong and well equipped because of foreign support, we have to take into account that the other side also have foreign support. One of my
that is the argument you make about the coalition and balance of power. You argue the war with Eritrea, for example, wouldn't be a simple two-state affair. You argued that Ethiopia's rebel forces, the Tigrayan army, Amhara Fano, the Ola in Oromia, the Oromo Liberation Army, could realign in unpredictable ways. I think that speculation or that assessment of yours was vindicated because yesterday The Economist released a story in which they seem to confirm an alliance between Tigrayan army, Amhara Fano, and the Oromo Liberation Army. They mentioned about a meeting that took place in Sudan. That is The Economist. I'm quoting The Economist. So coalitions and balance of power was your argument. Foreign powers from Egypt and the UAE being another nexus to that, that you said would quickly shape the conflict. Shed a little more light on that, please.
There is really a change in nature of war in recent years, not just in our country, but also if we take many of the civil wars that have taken place over the last 10 years. The participants have increased. Back in the day, you will have two primary forces that fight. Then you will have maybe an international regional backer. But these days, when two sides fight, whether they fight, interstate or intrastate war, there is more than one party that gets directly involved.
In 2023, when he first said that a country of 150 million population cannot be landlocked or a geographic prisoner, to use, I think, his term. And since then, this speech by different politicians, army members, sometimes we are 120, sometimes we are 130 million. Recently, the army chief of staff said that in 25 years, we are going to be 200 million. And he said a country of 2 million cannot hold a country of 200 million hostage, something akin to that. And this is a justification for access to the sea. What the argument is the country is large, cannot remain landlocked. I don't think Ethiopians in general want to see their country remain landlocked. The general sentiment is that. But in my view, at face value, yes, it's a valid argument, but this demographic reasoning has since turned into very perilous argument when it becomes a moral arithmetic, implying that smaller nations' sovereignty can be overridden by Ethiopia's sheer size. It is also an attempt to convert demographics into legitimacy.
On the street, any town across the country, what are the top two most important issues to you? They are going to say cost of living and security. They cannot go to their villages, they cannot go to their churches, they cannot feed their children, they cannot pay rent. And what do these two problems have in common? The economic insecurity, the economic hardship and the insecurity. They have war. It is the prolonged civil war, the prolonged war Abiy put the country into, that has led to deterioration of security and collapse of the economy. Now Abiy is prescribing another war on top of the war. So while people, do not mind, and they would probably be happy if the port, if Ethiopia gets access to the sea or gets Assab, an idea that you ask them to go to another war while they are suffering from previous and ongoing war, it just doesn't work. The other important issue
this is the aspect you said, the economic aspect, the current economic condition. I'm triggered to ask you a question, because we know historically, nationalism in Ethiopia, war is one of the, I think, the unifying nationalism, the prospect of it. We've seen during the first Ethiopia-Eritrean war in 98-2000. Has nationalism lost its unifying power in Ethiopia because the economic, the dire economic condition, the struggle that Ethiopians have been going through the last 7 years, the fatigue that, what you are mentioning now? Is it safe to say that has contributed to the loss of nationalism in unifying Ethiopians? The moral exhaustion will not allow for a possibility of another war. You are arguing that Ethiopia's economy is collapsing under debt, inflation, and corruption. Now, I am no economist. I would, argue the economists to say that war is luxury the country cannot afford at the moment. I think it does not require one to be an economist to argue that. You also argued that, by contrast, Eritrea's militarized command economy is, shall I say, grimly designed to survive conflict. You created a very interesting parallel there, that a new war would devastate Ethiopia's finances and Ethiopia's economy to the core. What is the state of the economy that make you to make this assessment about a war economy and the impossibility of it?
As I've always argued, Abiy inherited an economy that was already in trouble. After Meles' death, the economy was mismanaged under Haile Mariam. We all remember how the generals came in and mismanaged, siphoned the money from the large-scale projects that would have transformed the country. And instead of engaging in a recovery process, he made the economic situation worse by engaging the country in two destructive endeavors. One, the wars. The wars, depending on who you ask, the cost has been 60 billion to 100 billion cost in Tigray, in Amhara, in Oromia. And as I said earlier, these wars are not fought in the peripheral areas. So we cannot just count the direct cost of the war, the opportunity cost, the culture that has been disrupted, the internal trade that has been disrupted, the foreign direct investment that did not come or flew away. So the economy has been in serious trouble. And you don't have to be an economist study. You just have to have a relative in hometown. You just have to have a civil servant or a small business owner or even a wealthy person. I have not seen anybody in Ethiopia today who does not complain about the economic situation. The civil servant is, as you see, they have been protesting. We've been echoing their voice. They have difficulty meeting their basic food and shelter requirements. The small businesses, they have been overtaxed. The bigger businesses, they are overtaxed. They are exposed to massive corruptions. So the economy is in a very, very serious crisis.
Ethiopia's own foreign policy strategic failures, policy inconsistencies, and shifting doctrines, especially toward Eritrea. Most striking was the omission of the defining events of the past 8 years. That includes the 2020-2022 brutal war in the Tigray region, a war that devastated millions of civilians and reshaped the political landscape of the Horn. Under the leadership of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and President Isaias Afwerki, the governments of Ethiopia and Eritrea, respectively, stand accused of crimes against humanity and war crimes, including mass killings, gang rape, and other forms of sexual violence and widespread displacement.
The current state of relations between Eritrea and Ethiopia has gone through historical cycles of conflict between the two countries. but that the present is not about history. So he distinguished between the two, but in general, he diagnosed the reason that there is a heightened conflictual relationship today between the two states. I dare say that there are two states there. But yeah, what you're saying is there is historical pattern, cyclical conflict between the two countries, an enduring pattern of hostility. It's not something that started on the watch of the Prosperity Party. He condemns it as simplistic, to simply connect it to Ethiopia's quest for access to the Red Sea. Cites historical, economic, geographic, and structural causes. And as I said, blame some external manipulation, not just the relationship between the two countries today, but the diagnosis is historical and the multidimensionality of the causes. And that is, of course, to be expected, that there is no single cause that leads to unending relationship of conflict between two countries. Then he talked about the contemporary Ethiopian orientation as far as Horn of Africa policy is concerned, and then Eritrea's policy is concerned, and talked about Ethiopia's strategic restraint, Ethiopia's commitment to regional stability, and presented his vision for integration as a prescription for a stable, peaceful relationship between the two countries. So there are really three pillars there: the diagnosis, the contemporary orientation, and the prescriptions for the future of the relationship between the two countries.
I want to pick your brain first. Does the doctrine or the speech misdiagnose the causes of conflict by reducing, as you said, the multi-layered crisis to Eritrea's hostility, while ignoring Ethiopia's historical accounts, militarization, and a failed implementation of legal frameworks, or its own relationship, foreign policy relations with Eritrea? So I wanted to follow that because I want you to address that. If I can ask you to make a short response together with this one. Is Ethiopia externalizing blame instead of recognizing its own role in shaping threat perceptions and instability? When we talk about the diagnosis flaws of the speech itself.
In his historical analysis, he does not talk about what created Eritrea, but the roots of the difference between Ethiopia and Eritrea today doesn't start in 1952 with the federation. That was completely excised. And then all of the relationships that they had, maybe in the 1980s, the Derg and all that, the fact that Eritrea became independent because the EPLF and other associated forces defeated the Ethiopian state, they don't want to talk about that. They really deny that Ethiopia was defeated. Even the dissolution of the federation, the way the Foreign Minister presented is that Ethiopia and Eritrea, and I like the way he speaks about it, that they experienced federation, complete unification, and then cessation. That's how he presented it. Well, they experienced a federation for 10 years, and then it was a complete unification. Well, that's not how the Eritreans see, because the difference started with the dissolution of the federation by the Ethiopian Empire. And when I say the Ethiopian Empire, that was the name of the Ethiopian state at the time. It was the Empire of Ethiopia, legal name of it. So that is where the problem starts. The problem starts with that dissolution of the federation. The EPLF and other liberation organizations actually started because the federation was dissolved by the Ethiopian crown without the consent of most of the Eritreans. Says Eritrea is 2 million and we are 200 million, increasing the Ethiopian population and decreasing the Eritrean population. When they say that, or when an ambassador from Kenya simply denies that Eritrea is an independent, and when a score of generals, sometimes academics in the military establishment, are denying Eritrea, bemoaning that Ethiopia was done wrong by its own people. That's not restraint. That's not restraint. I don't see that as a restraint. Even now, that is what he quoted as the number one issue, is that Eritrea is not acting as a sovereign state. What that means is that if you don't act as a sovereign state and act responsibly as that, in order to protect my own interest, I will attack you. It's the implication. That's not restraint. When Eritrea is presented as an instrument of other states, in this case, the state in the background, the enemy in the background, the historic enemy in the background is Egypt. When you tell Eritreans that you're an instrument, well, if this is presenting an existential threat to Ethiopia, you just have to act. So that even second point that he cited as a cause for past conflict is actually a springboard for another war. When he says the Isaiah's doctrine, which he says was not written, it's not written, but it is a pattern of behavior, that Eritrea's security is dependent on Ethiopia's insecurity. What are you going to do? If Eritrea's existence is on the basis of Ethiopia's insecurity, to help Ethiopia, to protect Ethiopian insecurity, you just have to prepare for war. When you describe the Eritrean states still suffering psychologically from the Nakfa syndrome of acting like bandits, not like a state, that the internal politics of Ethiopia translates only to confrontational foreign policy, that the existence of Eritrean state, even in their history, they talk about that Eritrea was simply created by the Italians to deny Ethiopia access to the sea. And today Eritrea exists. The raison d'etre is the word that he used. The raison d'etre of Eritrea is to deny Ethiopia access to the sea. And as they presented, Ethiopia's existence in the future only depends on access to the sea or a sovereign port. Well, then Ethiopia has only one option: to go to war. That's what even the assessment is showing. And the other thing is that Ethiopia's historical trauma, he says. Well, young people are today, they don't even remember it. But we have to think anew, say innovation. And he exhorts young people who were born since 1993 and only know Eritrea as an independent state. Even you have to think differently. Ethiopia cannot exist without a port. All of those 5 points that were presented as a diagnosis were presented as a springboard for another war. That's why we're trying to say this is not good for Ethiopia, for Ethiopians, for Eritrea, for the region, and for the entire Mediterranean basin, Mediterranean Red Sea basin.
The Karayu community, custodians of one of the oldest democratic traditions in the continent, has repeatedly found itself targeted by a state security architecture that seems unable and at times unwilling to distinguish between political insurgency and sacred indigenous authority. On December the 2nd, 2021, 14 Karrayyu Gadaa leaders were summarily executed during a sacred prayer ceremony, an atrocity that shocked the Oromo people and the country at large. The victims included Dilo Dido, the Abagada of the area. A week before their killing, the government tried to recruit soldiers from the Karrayyu community for military training for its war against the Oromo Liberation Army, a move rejected by the Karayu elders. The government first denied responsibility, then blamed the Ola, until Addis Standard's reporting, which later on confirmed by the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, revealed the truth. A clandestine state security unit acting with approval from senior officials. In early 2025, 20 Karrayyu Gadaa leaders and community elders disappeared for 21 days. No explanation, no charges, no due process. The families searched police stations, carried food to places they hoped might hold them, and received only denial. Addis Standard publication later confirmed they had been held inside an army military camp near Awash Arba. A troubling pattern emerges. State repeatedly inserting itself into the Gadaa system.
That comes to mind now, and I'm sure was my reaction 4 years ago, is that for me it signals a state, a nation state, that although by what it says, it proclaims that it is taking steps forward in the direction of progress and direction of democracy, of democratic or fostering a democratic society, we seem to see the same patterns of behavior reflective even of not just Ethiopia in the state of the constitutional order it's currently under, but it seems to still be reflecting much of its colonial and roots as an empire, in the way that it tells us its story of itself to its mass. It can never do any wrong. It's always the other or someone else that is responsible for the social ills that people are facing, and just this sense of blatant superiority in terms of in its relationship with its base, with its mass, with its people, whereby it cannot even have the most basic of conversations, in an honest and straightforward and a transparent manner. Two-part response to this. There is this, but there's, I think, also that this Ethiopian state has never changed in its own nature from being an authoritarian body when it comes to its relationship with its people. So in the context of authoritarianism, it is not necessarily just that you are a dissenting voice or that you are opposing to the central power that creates fear in the state. It's also being neutral. Because if you're neutral, then you can't really be surveilled. You can't really be manipulated. You can't really be coerced. And I think the Karayyu's efforts to remain difficultly in what would be a neutral position, I think this causes state a lot of fear. And in this neutrality, I think there is more relationship, possibly. I think, again, this comes to the relationship between the two and the way the state is making this relationship. In that position of being neutral, I think the potential that this society in and of itself, because that is what the Karrayyu are, of course, they are part of the wider body politic of Ethiopia and of the Oromo too, but they do exist as, a society unto themselves who practice really the Oromo way of life and the law and the culture in ways that other parts of Oromia don't, just like other parts don't practice like the Karrayyu, so on and so forth. But the likelihood that maybe the Karrayyu might, if they ever decide to shift from this position of neutrality, might not necessarily lean towards the OLF's political position, but might embody the same core values that lie at the very heart.
Revelation of the Reuters investigation was to situate that assassination, to situate the whole narrative of that mass assassination of the leaders. Your reflections, Sorati.
It was totally groundbreaking. It was totally groundbreaking to have by, a trusted, independent, journalistic body that is recognized internationally, to produce its analysis and its investigations, to really the highest international standard of journalism. Not that local news stations don't necessarily do this, but we understand the significance why we're talking about it. We understand the significance of Reuters doing such an investigation and then revealing, these things within us. So what was the significance of this for me particularly? When the state gets backed up into a corner. We didn't even back them up into a corner in this case, actually, with the Karrayyu assassinations. We moved on from it collectively quite quickly. But let's say that we did. And let's say that another moment reveals itself, where we do. Almost like we kind of did with Haj Alu. With Haj Alu, what they did and what they learned, actually, the state learned, is that they can somewhat bypass the analysis of this is a structural issue by putting the blame fully and totally on the person who does what? Pulls the trigger. And we know that that is not going to be arresting or putting in jail the person whom they put in front of that trigger, in front of that gun, because that's what this Reuters investigation showed us, that this was a line of decision-making processes that began far, far, far ahead of or beyond or above of the person that pulled those triggers and killed those 14 members of the Karayu leadership. But what we've seen the state do, and I'm using Hajj's example to say that if they can arrest one person or two people or three people, the mentality and how we perceive or receive justice can still somewhat be satisfied by this. Like collectively, our analysis is still, they're still able to protect themselves from us making too much of a structural analysis. What this Reuters investigation did for us, I think, is make it very black and white and say, even if you are able to, or if they decide we're backed up too far in a corner and we need to give the people some semblance, some breadcrumb of justice, we can take the one, put them in the, kangaroo court trial. These are the ones who picked up the gun, who went and who made this. And now we are also on the side of, the heroic, we were playing a heroic role in this story because we're using our justice systems to administer. No. What that Reuters investigation showed us is that it is not, what's this metaphor? They say one apple I'm going in a direction where I can't fulfill that. But what I'm saying is that the investigation showed us that the issue is deep, that it is structural, that this was something that was vetted, approved, by people, not just within the policing and military structures, but within, the overall political body within Oromia and within Ethiopia.
If the elders do not cooperate, no, this comes as no surprise for us now. But we need to situate how this undermines the cultural autonomy of the Oromo people under the so-called Oromo government. This term itself makes me pretty uncomfortable to say so, but it is, the widely circulating narrative, right? How debasing is this for the cultural autonomy of one of the ancient traditions of in Africa, not just in Ethiopia, right? To threaten the elders to say, like, we're going to withhold your Gadaa ceremonies if you don't cooperate with us in terms of reintegrating fighters. Situate this for us, sir. Sarati, please.
Yeah, the indignation that I feel, even as you make this recounts, is extremely visceral. And towards the end of it, as you were speaking there, you made a connection that we cannot miss in this conversation. That this moment we're talking about, this assassination of these indigenous leaders, is also indicative of the state and all of the state's, let's say, arms and legs, whether it is imperialism or capitalism, whether it's a military, all of the state's relationships to indigenous people on this continent and globally, that this moment should reflect to global indigenous communities, the nature of their relationship to the state. So it's a learning moment for all of us. And I really wanted to highlight that as we spoke, Tsedale. But yes, the indignation is really visceral. And it's really, I'll put it this way. We've seen this last couple of years, the Bali, the Barsa, so the power transfer ceremonies take place in different parts of Oromia with full resource and support of the state behind them. Marketing resource, whether it's facilitating on the ground, really, and again, the state has used these moments to bolster itself and, to create a self-image that it uses, to add its whim, and it actually uses to further its ability to act with violent impunity. Because it says, I can't be violent. Look here, I'm facilitating indigenous ceremonies, whatever. These moments that have taken place have really broken my heart, and I have struggled to recognize them for, as holding the reverence and really the glory and the beauty that they really do as one Oromo person. Why? Because I know that they're being co-opted, and their power is really being funneled into the state structure. By them, really the states getting behind them the way that they do. And it's amazing to see them on these platforms, but at the same time, when we know that it is also the cost of silence, or when we know that it's also the power that the state is using to forward itself, then it becomes really contradictory for an Oromo to really stand at that moment with full pride and with full reverence for who we are. And so when we come to the Karrayyu in this moment, and when we hear the state talking to them in this way, really all I can say is, if the Karayu were today to facilitate a ceremony of significance to us as an Oromo nation, be it Eritrea, the annual Eritrea, or whether it be the Eritrea that take place multiple times within the year or anything else, I swear it's the only ceremony I as an Oromo would feel proud to stand up and to recognize, because they have really stayed true to the depth of the value system of the Oromo worldview, and they have represented what it really means to be an Oromo at this time. And the last thing I want to say on this, Tsedale, is that if we're seeing here, the state is saying, I'll withhold your power, to practice an Oromo ceremony in this time because you will not comply with me, and because I don't see actually the reverence and the significance of your place in cultural law and society outside of being able to use you politically. So they're saying I have no relationship, where they're revealing themselves here. I have no relationship to the Oromo you have a relationship with, because if I did, I would not dare speak those words, because that ceremony happening would matter to me regardless of my political position. I don't know exactly squarely what people are landing on, but I imagine, that it is a mix of these things. And so that self-reflection, if these conclusions are part of the equation, that self-reflection would be quite self-destructive. It would create such a dissonance, between reality and what you know. If you really, these other 2 points that I mentioned, you believe something can be salvaged, or you believe more threat is on the horizon, you can't necessarily go inward and make these analyses, because that analysis is going to lead you to complete rejection.
Today, we confront a question at the heart of Ethiopia's continued unraveling. Just 5 years ago, the Amhara regional state and its political elite were framed as a staunch ally or even a stabilizing pillar of Ethiopia's new political order following Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's rise in 2018. The region stood central to the federal state's power and to the narrative. But today, it is the epicenter of rebellion, militarization, and mass suffering. What unfolded in between is not only a regional state crisis, it is the story of a national political architecture cracking from its center. Since 2018, we have witnessed a churn of leadership without precedent. The regional state itself has witnessed 5 regional presidents in 5 years, each of them removed, discredited, or killed. We have seen wartime allies mutate into open confrontation. We have watched a ruling party hollowed out by purges. And we have watched the Fano collective shift from celebrated wartime allies during what is popularly known as the Tigray War to the federal government's most serious internal security threat. But beneath the political collapse lies a deeper, darker layer. The immeasurable human cost borne overwhelmingly by civilians, women, children, and the elderly. A recent investigative report by the BBC revealed a disturbing detail of sexual violence used as a weapon of war. Communities are cut off from medical care. Health workers are facing retaliation simply for documenting abuses. In many cases, entire districts are flattened by fighting with no real end in sight. How does a region once seen as Ethiopia's political anchor of stability become the epicenter of war in a span of 5 years, Hona? If you could walk us back and enlighten us a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you, Tsedale. I think that's an important question to understand how things have unfolded, but also what could be done to reverse the trend that has been going on in the region and more broadly, as you said, in the country. But we may have to go far beyond 5 years to understand the conflict in Amhara region. And this is because this war in Amhara region, or at least its series didn't start 5 years ago. In fact, it predates the Abiy regime. It predates TPLF even to a certain degree, because the fundamental reason Amharas are fighting in the region, or at least Fanos are fighting the Abiy regime, is because they have come to a point where they have realized there's no table where Amharas are allowed to sit in Ethiopian political discourse. And this quest for, to be at the table, to be to present their grievances and to kind of seek a solution that is good for everyone has been going on during TPLF-led Oromo, TPLF-led EPRDF, and now Oromo Prosperity-led Prosperity Party under Abiy. But I think what has happened in between is obviously there was a number of triggering factors that contributed to the immediate outburst of the war. One of them being, we've seen ever since, Abiy became prime minister, the massacre of civilians, particularly Amharas, have been happening everywhere. And actually, ever since Abiy came to power, Amharas have been protesting again and again across Ethiopia, but mainly in Amhara region, calling for an end to these atrocities, killings of civilians, particularly in Oromo region, but in other regions as well. And this repeated ask for ending of violence against Amharas have been met with more violence. You might recall, in April 2023, there was a widespread demonstration in Amhara region that involved, tens of thousands of Amharas and happened in more than 24 cities. And the response from the region was to kill more of those protesters. And I think that is one of the fundamental reasons that the violence against Amharas have intensified instead of being contained. And they not only it intensified in magnitude, the response has been honestly from the elites, particularly Oromo Prosperity Party leaders, it was justified. It's acceptable to kill them. And we have seen a number of recordings leaked, but also public speeches, such as what Shumel Sabdesa said in his speech in Addis Ababa, where he said, "We're blocking them. We're going to separate them. Those of you who are speaking and who are not an Amhara, you should be quiet. We are doing our work of suppressing or confusing Amharas, and this is beneficial for their dominance." But also, I think there was an increasing intensification of violence, particularly in urban areas.
To talk about beyond the political collapse, right now, what we were discussing about is a political collapse. I can categorically call it a political collapse. But beyond that, Hone, lies the silent catastrophe, which is lost in the details of the political collapse, the crisis, often covered, which the civilians are bearing the heaviest cost of this. So I want to over the past 2.5 years, we've even, with the smallest team that we have at Addis Standard, we've been chronicling the devastation on women, children, and the elderly are absorbing, the immeasurable cost, the destruction of the system. I mean, now, even after the report last week or two ago by the BBC, I can say now that sexual violence is being used as a weapon of war, which is not unheard of in the current political dispensation that we have. And there is this mass displacement. There is this war that decimated the health system, that decimated the schools. Out of the 9 million children that are not going to the school in Ethiopia today, almost half of them are from the Amhara region, followed by in Oromo region.
People are dealing with a situation where every day they're gambling between staying in home, probably at least avoiding bullets, stray bullets or bullets targeting them. If not, they wouldn't avoid those who are visiting to rape and kill them. But at least if they stay home, they would avoid a stray bullet as well. But then that would mean they would have to die out of hunger. So every day they are gambling the debate between should I stay in home and kind of try to stay alive while being starved, or should I go do something to get food and risk being raped and killed? Yeah. So this is a story that's happening everywhere in the Amhara region, as has been reported, by several media outlets. About 8% of the region is under the final control, and the military launches fightings or campaigns to kind of regain these areas from cities. And therefore, there is a fighting on a daily basis and across the region. And that has really worsened the human rights situation.
In October 2018, in the Eritrean capital, Asmara, the Ethiopian government and the Ogaden National Liberation Front, ONLF, signed what was widely described at that time as a historic peace agreement. It was meant to close one of Ethiopia's longest conflicts, to end decades of armed conflict in the Somali region. It is a peace agreement that would be addressing the root cause of the conflict. You expressed quite a large, list of optimism with regard to the constitutional order and federalism and also. So 5 years down the line, or even 7 years since you have signed that agreement, I want to ask you, what happened? What went wrong?
ONLF believed it was entering a genuine and historic peace process intended to confront the political roots of a conflict that extended for more than a century. The Somali people were fighting the Ethiopian state almost in the early 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. So, and even before that, even during Menelik's time, there was always a confrontation. So we saw that this is an opportune moment to end that conflict in a peaceful way and start a new chapter in Ethiopia. You know, as a person, Abiy Ahmed is one individual in a cog. What we saw and we discovered soon was the question of Ethiopia is beyond an individual. It's a paradigm system that was built on injustice, tyranny, and systematic, suppression of democracy. And any leader who goes into that, system, immediately he was caught up in that system. So what we saw immediately, this culture, there's this cultural, problem in Ethiopia that always those in power, even when you look at the attitude of the people.
You didn't have it easy, even after you've signed, and your party was removed from the list of terrorist organizations that, alongside the ONLF and the Gumbot 7 in 2018. You didn't have it easy, even for electoral, participation. But then, as I said, the police crackdown in the Somali regional state, closure of your offices in Nogob, in Jarar, in Karrayyu, and then Dr. Abdurrahman, what we saw is the rise of state-backed alternative ONLF faction in Jijjiga.
What was happening to us was not isolated only to ONLF. We have seen our colleagues in ONLF, how Dawood was detained and made house arrest, how ONLF was also muddled and, a group created within ONLF. It happened even within Gumbot 7, how Gumbot 7 was divided and dismantled. So this was all a systematic program against all the opposition parties to weaken them, to divide them so that they can become just only nominal. First of all, the only difference for us as ONLF was some other parties were armed, but we have fully disarmed. They could not use certain, counterinsurgent tactics except the political ones. So it was exactly the same in 1995. That's exactly what happened. The API did that. We had 5 times ONLF chairman, they created 5 ONLFs from the last 20 years. From 1995, the first when we went to they attacked us and closed our offices, they created their own ONLF, and then another group was created. It didn't work, another group was created. So this was the same pattern, try to weaken, divide, and, vilify so that you can control them.
The Somali question, how should the Somali question should be resolved first? Because that is what you said in March 2025. No justice, no oil. The Somali question must be resolved first.
PP doesn't want any political opposition which is genuine, can stand for the right of the people, which can stand for democratic rights. So PP sees threat, they see ONLF as a threat, they see TPLF as a threat, they see ONLF, the genuine ONLF, real genuine ONLF as a threat. So they see other parties like that. They don't want those parties to challenge their rule, including not only economic, political, and social. What they want is compliant parties That will get the little amount given by Nebe, and then when the election comes, they say, okay, the election was fair, and the rest they just watch the drama in Addis Ababa. That's the type of party they want. They don't want a genuine party that can challenge them politically, economically, and socially. Peace is interest for all people, including the federal government, all Ethiopian people, all other parties, all other regions. But peace cannot be sustained when one party only. You cannot have peace alone. Alone cannot have peace. Peace needs two partners. At least means multi-partners. If one side persists on peace, the other is not doing peace, the risk of a conflict increases. And actually now that's what we are afraid of. That's what we've been warning about. Our members are so much disgruntled. We don't know what will come tomorrow because the people have lost now in peace.
The most unsettling dimension of this tragedy, argues political scholar and historian Professor Tsedale Lemma, is not violence alone. It is complicity. In a powerful article that was published on May the 30th on Addis Standard website, titled Worse Than Evil, How Stupidity Fueled Ethiopia into a Raging Inferno, Professor Tsedale confronts a disturbing question. How did violence become so socially acceptable? Why did civic leaders, cultural figures, and even religious authorities, once voices of restraint, become cheerleaders of war? Drawing on the work of German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Professor Tsedale argues that Ethiopia's collapse cannot be explained by evil intent alone, nor by blind obedience. Instead, he points to something more corrosive, cultivated stupidity, a systematic rejection of reason and moral judgment that renders societies blind to truth and indifferent to suffering. In this condition, dehumanizing language becomes normal, mass days becomes defensible, and silence becomes participation. Tsedale argues that governance driven by contrarian impulse, hostility to deliberation, and systematic dismissal of alternative voices did not only unleash violence.
If the leadership is bureaucratic, it is rules-based, and it's routinized. If it is traditional, like kings or the Pope, charisma is restrained by the sanctity of tradition. If it is based on the person, on the initial appeal of the person, it becomes irrational, and charisma becomes dangerous in that moment. Because charisma does not mean any one thing. You can give it 10 definitions about charisma. When it applies to power and power relations, charisma could be seen in one of two ways. That a person in leadership position, in positions of power, that is governed by institutions, not by the appeal, the personality appeal, then charisma could become a transformational leadership. But even demagogues, and often in times of crisis, in moments of interregnum, demagogues enter the political field and they assume power, and there is no restraint on them. That is when charisma is really dangerous, a dangerous genie let out of the bottle. So charisma may be necessary in moments of transition.
Also, I have to reflect on this aspect and honestly. And here is where you called that cultivated stupidity as the indispensable condition that makes genocide socially excusable, if not acceptable. Is it safe for me to say now that such proportions of crime cannot happen without the mass participation of widespread amount of people? Can we say that it could happen just by the incitement of the few elite? Is that what our experience tells us is there?
Yeah, I mean, not just genocide, but there are different kinds of mass atrocity crimes in the world today. Could it happen just because the leader wanted it? No, it requires harnessing the technological and the scientific capacities of the state, the security, the legal, the moral acquiescence of the people. It requires, look, the leaders could plan, but you need the executioners. People who actually do the heinous job of murdering and maiming and displacing. So genocide is a different category, but there are atrocity crimes that are mass violence or violence on a gargantuan scale. One is a negotiated transition charter, not one that was concocted by individuals and given to the prime minister, but a negotiated transitional charter that clearly defined the interim powers, that explicitly limited the executive discretion, and that agreed to the sequencing of the reforms. The sequencing of this is really important. It's not only the charter, Saidi, it's also the sequencing. That is, which reform should come first. I remember at that time writing and publishing in the Horn of Africa about how it should be sequenced. Electoral reform, followed by a legal sector reform, then security sector reform, and then economic reform. It had its own logic. So when you put one before the other, it just doesn't work. So that is the first property, that if there was a negotiated transition charter, it would have reined in on this uncontrollable power. Second is, if the transition charter or a roadmap had institutional veto points, that there were independent courts that protected the reform, that there was a transitional council that represented the major political forces, and that there were clear rules on emergency power. If there was a procedural friction that would have slowed down bad decisions, that would be the second condition. And the third is the depersonalized vision of legitimacy. Leaders themselves cannot commit that. But people become automatons. They are reduced to automatons. They react not because they do not understand that, well, actually put it this way, they do not understand. They cannot have sympathy or compassion for the experience of the other person because they don't look at them as human beings. These are already dehumanized through action and dehumanized through discourse. They're not human. They are less than human. Nobody sees in Ethiopia as what is happening in, whether that is Fano or Shane or Junta. All of these characterizations are meant to dehumanize first, so that when you kill them, you don't feel that you're killing human beings. When you put them on a fire, and then human pyre is not seen as if you're killing a human being. When you burn people inside the house and then take selfies or videos, you don't feel like you're killing human beings because the ground is set. People have become automatons rather than intelligent beings.
For a brief moment in 2023, the guns in Oromia seemed closer to falling silent. Talks between the Ethiopian government and the Oromo Liberation Army opened in Zanzibar under what mediators at that time described as an encouraging trust-building atmosphere. IGAD, alongside Norway and Kenya, spoke of good faith. Expectations rose. But by November, that moment had slipped away. 2 rounds of negotiations ended without agreement, exposing a rupture not of the process, but of the politics.
For political participation is made, mind you. He made them in July, his first visit to Amhara. The first thing he said was, get rid of this self-determination business. Just forget about it. This, I tell you, I wasn't there. I tell you in confidence because I'm told by the people who were there. That was his first message to the ONLF leadership. The agreement was made, of course, a few months later, in which Lemma, president of Oromo at the time, and Karrayyu Gadaa, who was foreign minister, participated. It wasn't respected, as you know, but the tone is set by the prime minister, really, to just get rid of self-determination.
Hunde Darissa, the former Ola commander, they laid their arms down. They got, engaged were involved in the reintegration process. But then they were released and they were extrajudicially executed. Many of them were also arbitrarily arrested. I think this is a very extraordinary parallel to make here because maybe my memory does not serve me well in which no process, while the Oromo Liberation Front in Addis, led by Dawood, was always willing to give politics a chance. At the same time, in parallel, this was happening. That is what happened in July of 2020, following the assassination of artist Hajal Hundesa. What quickly happened was the house arrest of Jal Dawood Ibsa, who have been denied access to his own headquarters. We've been reporting about that as well, but that eventually culminated in the split of the ONLF itself. And the party was further weakened. Jal Dawood Ibsa spent the next years in house arrest. The Ethiopian Human Rights Commission itself was repeatedly pleading for the party leader to be set free, to be able to organize his own party structures. That didn't happen. So the parties are still paralyzed with that division that was created after that. And the government gave positions to the other parts that were splitting away from the ONLF, or disarmament first, and then negotiation next. Is it a correct reading of why the peace talk collapsed? I don't want to push you into the indulging points that as part of the negotiation team that you don't want to, make in the public domain. But what can we take as a lesson? What exactly happened? Because the whole thing was shrouded in a lot of secrecy, Jiantaha, and I'm not going to let you go without having a little bit of what happened inside the negotiation table. It's just a bit more than what you're saying, yes, if you don't mind.
I would probably start by saying that on the government side, the going to negotiation, it was no more than a political relations stance, really, to be honest. I should put it that way. For us, because we are concerned about our struggle, our people, the price our people are paying, we are serious, down to us, really, to reach an honorable solution. That is really my honest opinion. On the government side, there was no preparation because, it will have a consequence. If we reach an agreement this time, it will have to lead to some concrete steps after that. We wouldn't settle unless we see the path to free political work, free political movement, working with our people towards our people exercising their right to elect their leaders. But I think the constitutional order that exists today is the bare minimum that can bring the different forces together. So if that is observed, there will be hope for the Oromo forces to come together to work with other similarly inclined forces and put pressure on the regime to come to the negotiation table and accept the conditions that end the conflict. The conditions to end the conflict are acceptance of a rule of law, human rights, rights of peoples. There's no going back on the gains since 1991. Ethiopia got a dramatic chance.
Zanzibar and Dar es Salaam. I wonder if your assessment is shared by the chain of command leadership within the OLA, or this understanding that there is nothing that prevents Oromia from becoming Ethiopia's permanent war zone. Is this the same understanding that's shared by the leaders of the Oromo Liberation Army? This is my last question. Is it the same assessment that is there within the chain of command of the Oromo Liberation Army, as you are outlining it here right now? And if the understanding that we have to prevent Oromia from becoming Ethiopia's permanent war zone, because we're entering our 8th year now since the active conflict, even in the post-2018, the first war started in Oromia. I wonder if this understanding is also the same understanding within the chain of command of the Oromo Liberation Army.